Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG Show. I've been talking on this live stream the last couple of weeks using a phrase which was coined by Bishop Athanasius Schneider of the Catholic Church, the sanitary dictatorship, which is what we live under now because of the coronavirus. And I thought that I had heard something like that before, and then I realized that, yes, there actually was a sanitary dictatorship in the past. It was in Poland. Poland had a movement called sanation, which means healing. And it became official government policy after the 1926 coup, where Marshal Józef Pilsudski came to power. A healing of the body of Poland. Pilsudski became dictator of a country that was riven with all kinds of divisions, ethnic divisions in particular. Pilsudski took the position against the nationalists that anyone who put Poland first was a Pole. After Pilsudski's death in 1935, the sanation movement split into various groupings. And Pilsudski was, I suppose, the only man who could keep Poland together, who could keep it as a country which could perhaps withstand the twin threats of Hitler and of Stalin. And of course, 4 years after Pilsudski's death, Poland was crucified, first by Hitler and then by Stalin. You may have heard a particular joke about Canada, and it goes like this. How do you get 50 Canadians out of a swimming pool? You say, please get out of the swimming pool. Now, this joke is supposed to indicate how feeble Canadians are and how deferential they are to authority. But I suppose the joke is on everyone else now, because essentially all around the Western world, people have been told, get out of the swimming pool. Okay, we're going to get out of the swimming pool. Get out of the streets. Stay where you live or else. Do you have a license to walk that dog? Do you have a license to ramble in the hills? Do you have a license to shoot hoops? Well, if you don't, you're in trouble. Now, I made a prediction, a bold prediction. I guess, what was it, about 10 days ago, around that time, that we would find out with regard to coronavirus that it seems to have been overplayed, to put it mildly. As I said, the bodies are not stacking up like cordwood. The authorities, the elite, the powers that be would say, well, that's because of our draconian policies. So you should be ever so grateful to us and learn to love Big Brother. And there will be much more to come from Big Brother. Here's a story from the CBC. Physical distancing has halved spread of COVID-19 in BC, official modeling suggests. BC's 17 biggest hospitals have capacity to meet expected demand of severe outbreaks, officials say. That perhaps we're getting half the growth could be expected. But despite the glimmer of hope, Provincial Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Hendry and other officials stress that the province is not out of the woods and the healthcare system still needs to be prepared for an inevitable surge in hospitalizations. I'm trying not to overcall it, but I do believe we've seen a flattening, a falling off of that curve. What we need, though, is for everybody to continue to pay attention to these physical distancing measures so we can continue to prevent transmissions in our communities for the coming weeks. Well, how many coming weeks? How many coming weeks will it be before the authorities say we can try to rebuild our lives. Again, they will never admit that they made an atrocious error, that they wrecked our economies, that they needlessly terrorized tens, hundreds of millions of people based on their bogus model, or one bogus model in particular, a black box constructed by Professor Neil Ferguson at Imperial College London. Apparently, we've not suffered enough pain yet. And so in British Columbia, which has hardly been hit at all by coronavirus, they were modeling, comparing British Columbia with Italy, northern Italy in particular, which seems very strange to me because the conditions here are very different from what they are in Italy. But BC said there is a likely scenario of the province's outbreak ending up below or at the same level seen as Hubei province, where the pandemic originated in the city of Wuhan. The report found the 17 provincial hospitals identified as primary care centers would be prepared enough to handle that kind of outbreak. A briefing offered Friday, however, said that the network would be overwhelmed if BC's outbreak reached a level like northern Italy's. Again, it's not explained why health officials in British Columbia would think that there was any reason why British Columbia would suddenly come to resemble Italy. British Columbia has 5.1 million people in a province which is bigger than the entire country of France. Yes, but as I say, it looks like my prediction is coming true. One of the problems of the panic caused by what's happened in Italy is because the health authorities there have seen fit to ascribe every death of any person with the coronavirus as being caused by coronavirus. And it reminded me of something that I had learned about Epstein-Barr virus some years ago. Epstein-Barr virus is the virus which causes mononucleosis, and it causes other difficulties. According to the Centers of Disease Control, symptoms of EBV infection can include fatigue, fever, inflamed throat, swollen lymph nodes in the neck, enlarged spleen, swollen liver, and a rash. Most people become infected with EBV in childhood. 50% of American children have Epstein-Barr virus by the age of 5. EBV infections in children usually do not cause symptoms, or the symptoms are not distinguishable from other mild, brief childhood illnesses. So how many adults in the United States have Epstein-Barr virus? According to the Centers for Disease Control, about 90% of American adults. 90%. So imagine that everyone who died in the United States, let's say 90% of the total, who had Epstein-Barr virus, that the authorities said that this person died of Epstein-Barr virus. Well, that would be absurd, wouldn't it? But this is precisely what has happened in Italy. You know, I'm assuming that people with terminal cancer have coronavirus and they die, and then the death is attributed to coronavirus. Heart attacks, strokes, etc., etc. It's absolutely absurd, but that is the model that we have decided to adopt. Although in Italy, it's difficult to say. We know that this is the case in Italy. As for other places in the world, it may be the case that health authorities are not so eager as to say that coronavirus is the primary cause of a person's death. People have all sorts of viruses in their bodies. As it turns out, we don't really know all that much about viruses. It's my understanding that close to half the American population has the pneumonia virus in their bodies. Now, pneumonia is a terrible killer. particularly of old people. But it turns out that the pneumonia virus, for most people, is harmless unless one's immune system is terribly suppressed. And in cases like that, and you see that with people who have undergone operations, particularly transplant operations and the like, heart bypass operations or whatever, anything like that is very suppressive of the immune system and makes pneumonia a serious possibility. I was struck, going back to the idea of, Canadians being so willing to get out of the pool simply because someone asks them to. A piece by Tom Utley in the Daily Mail yesterday. I've been reading Utley for decades. He seems like a very sensible person. His piece yesterday is called "Not Since My Teens in Ridiculous Flares Have I Felt the Urge to Conform, but Even I Feel It Now." And why would he feel that? Well, because of panic. He lists a number of occasions on which he stood against the prevailing wisdom. And he writes, "Which brings me to these extraordinary times in which almost the entire global economy has been shut down, with the state intervening in our lives on a scale unprecedented in peacetime." I would say probably unprecedented in wartime as well. And all this on the say-so of an overwhelming majority of experts. So are the epidemiologists right, or are they wrong to tell us this is the only responsible course, whatever the cost? Having no scientific training, I have absolutely no idea of the answer. It's certainly possible that they have it right when they say nothing short of the measures being taken can save humanity from a tsunami of deaths. On the other hand, it is possible that the tiny minority of dissenters may have a point when they argue that the lockdown is likely to cause more suffering than the virus, though the thousands of families already mourning the deaths of their loved ones will certainly take a different view. But one thing I'm absolutely clear of, that governments all over the world have staked the farm on the lockdown strategy. This is no time for mavericks. The onus is on every one of us to suspend our reservations, bow to the conventional wisdom, put our trust in the experts, and pray that they have got it right. The time for arguing about policy will be after this nightmare is over. For now, we have no morally acceptable choice but to follow the chief medical officer's advice and the state's instructions to the letter. So it turns out that a totalitarian state is pretty easy to achieve. It's not necessary to engage in the terror collectivization, of agriculture. To give the example of Stalin and the Soviet Union, and we'll be talking about Stephen Kotkin's second volume of his Stalin biography. It is not necessary to jail hundreds of thousands, millions of people, to execute hundreds of thousands, millions of people. It's not necessary to construct gulags. All you have to do is to tell people that unless you decide to surrender all of your rights, you're going to die. It's that simple. You're going to die. But aren't the people who are dying, aren't they overwhelmingly over the age of 80 years old, or otherwise suffering from multiple morbidities? Let's see, morbid obesity, diabetes, etc., etc. Shut up. If you don't shut up, you are a traitor. All my life, I've listened to people ramble on about how much better we are in the West, particularly in the Anglosphere, than the rest of humanity because of our commitment to liberty. Well, it turns out it's all phony. It's all completely phony. So, getting back to Peter Hitchens, who's been a great hero of liberty in the past couple of weeks. Josh Jeffrey tweets to him, "I have friends who are doctors and are utterly overwhelmed by what's happened. Unprecedented levels of demand in hospitals, which will only get much, much worse over the next few weeks or even months." Hitchens replies, "Are these doctor friends of yours also prophets? Not sure how else they can be so certain over events of the next few weeks. Are these levels of demand unprecedented? There were 28,330 deaths from influenza complications in 2014-15. Can't imagine that was too easy. Oh no, but this is different. Oh, is it? How exactly is it different? Again, I will refer to the H1N1 pandemic of 2009 to 2010. This is again from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The final estimates were that from April the 12th, 2009 to April the 10th, 2010, there were approximately 60.8 million cases in the United States, 274,304 hospitalizations, and 12,469 deaths. It took quite some time for President Barack Obama to declare H1N1 a national emergency. In fact, I suppose if you hadn't been affected by this yourself, and of course many people, when you're talking about over 60 million people who are infected, well, most of these people are going to be asymptomatic or they're going to have only mild symptoms. My point being that, I read the news pretty assiduously and have done for quite some time, and I don't recall any particularly great interest in H1N1 at the time. Certainly there was no panic. Certainly there were no demands that we must listen to the experts and give ourselves over to a totalitarian state. So the Z-Man has had some very interesting columns this week. He writes today, a favorite expression is pressure reveals character. Anyone who has played sports has probably used the expression. It is one of those truths of life that turns up all over, but is most obvious in sports. Guys can look like heroes in practice when everyone is loose and there is nothing on the line. In the game, they perform poorly, unable to perform under pressure. It's why the military performs live fire exercises. A public crisis like the current panic over the virus is where we see how people operate under pressure. More than a few people who we thought to be steely-eyed cynics have been revealed to be hysterical ninnies. Nassim Taleb, who really likes to tell everyone he is a man's man, has gone so far as to post a one-page paper explaining how best to throw your dress over your head and run around shrieking like a girl. Those inclined to left-wing politics are more easily frightened than those attracted to more sober-minded approaches to public policy. I'll just interrupt here to say that the argument is being made that those people who were skeptical of the reasons advanced for the invasion of Iraq in 2003 are likely to be taking the responsible stand, which is totalitarianism, on coronavirus. I don't see it myself. It is something to keep in mind, as Z-Man continues, when looking at how our guys have reacted to this crisis. For example, many of the old alt-right people now sound like one of the girls from the Huffington Post. It is a good reminder that there is a left-right axis within dissident politics. And one of the old alt-right people that he's referring to, sounding like one of the girls from the Huffington Post, is Richard Spencer. Another thing the pressure of the moment has revealed, something I touch on, is that many of our guys are wholly ignorant of economics. Given that the rejection of the neoliberal economic order is one commonality on this side of the Great Divide, it's a bit surprising how many of our guys do not have the first clue about how the system really works. More than a few of our guys have taken to sounding like one of the girls from the Democratic Socialist camp. Similarly, people completely invested in politics can also become divorced from the daily reality of life. It's surprising just how many well-known figures in dissident politics don't have jobs and never had jobs. Maybe they kicked around the publishing world or the academy, but that's not real work. This is why the stimulus bills that get passed during each crisis gets bigger. There's no benefit to prudence, so no one considers it. There is a benefit to showering favorite constituents with cash, so everyone tries to be the most generous. It's also why these efforts never amount to much. These people don't have the slightest clue how the retail economy works. So the previous day, he was talking about the end times and how popular the subject of the end times is and was. For Americans, the vision of the end is usually one of two basic plots. One is a swift financial collapse that plunges everyone into chaos. Suddenly, the ATMs and credit cards no longer work, bank accounts freeze, and business grinds to a halt. If England is a nation of shopkeepers, America is a giant shopping mall that happens to possess a space-age military. Consumerism is the religion of the people. Another vision of the end times is the plague scenario. The super virus is a popular device to hustle along the collapsing and get right to the end times. The popular TV series Walking Dead is a great example of this. The current madness may give us a glimpse of how an actual collapse of civilization would unfold. We have both the threat of the super virus, real or imaginary, and the threat to the cult of consumerism. The reality of the virus in this case is unimportant because it is assumed to be real. The same is true of the financial markets. We may not be in an historical collapse, but it is assumed to be a real threat. In effect, this is a live action stress test of the system and people in charge of it. The first thing we can observe is the Great Lockdown started when the nation's circus performers went into hiding before anyone. The sports leagues and public entertainment operations were the first to respond. One would think that having them continue the show would make sense in order to keep spirits up during the lockdown, but that was not the case. In fact, the big streaming services downgraded their service quality at the start of the lockdown. Now, you can make of that all sorts of things depending upon your temperament, but the one important takeaway is that the people in charge are not at all concerned about people getting restless in the lockdown. Despite what we are told, they are not terribly concerned with the circus half of Juvenal's famous line, the reference to bread and circuses. They could be mistaken about that, especially as this thing drags on. Of course, the lockdown itself is important. The controlling ethos of the ruling class is unfettered movement. Yet in a crisis, the first instinct is to halt all movement. The people who just a few weeks ago were singing the glories of the free flow of people and goods are now threatening to weld our doors shut. Another thing we can observe in the present situation is how the authorities have started to abandon certain duties. For example, cities have started to throw open their prisons, letting the inmates run free. The argument is they could get the virus if locked up in close quarters. This means that the people in charge would rather see them raping and murdering in your neighborhood than possibly getting the virus and passing it to one of the bureaucrats operating the jails. We also see the cops abandon their duties. In Cincinnati, the cops are no longer responding to 911 calls. The stated reason is to reduce unnecessary contact between officers and the public to reduce the spread of COVID-19. Presumably, if you call while being murdered, they will come out to identify your body. But if you call while it is just at the home invasion stage, too bad for you. If you want to get a glimpse of what the breakdown of society will be like, think about this. Some people in dissident circles like to mock the paleocons, but the one thing the paleos got right before everyone else is anarcho-tyranny. Not only do we see this in our daily life in normal times, but it is in bold relief in this crisis. The first instinct of the people in charge is to tyrannically and oppressively regulate citizens' lives, yet is unable to enforce fundamental protective law. That's from Sam Francis. This is a crucial insight into the managerial system, but also how that system meets its device. Yes, I think that's an excellent analysis. One would have thought that becoming a policeman would entail a certain amount of risk. But our policemen have decided in recent years that any risk is too much risk. That's something of an exaggeration. But we have seen again and again with mass shootings, and this was first brought to light with Columbine, that the police believe that it is their duty not to save people, trapped in buildings where one or more shooters are determined to kill as many people as possible, but instead to secure the perimeter. That is, wait until the shooting stops, and hopefully the shooters have committed suicide, and then come in and count how many dead bodies there are. We've seen video of such mass shootings where students have held signs up saying, "My teacher's shot, bleeding to death, please help." And the cops, now, they just secure the perimeter because to do otherwise would not be prudent. So yeah, let's open up all of the jails. Maybe we can save a whole lot of money by radically downsizing the justice system, by laying off all these cops. If you're not going to keep them in prison, then what's the point of arresting them in the first place? Okay, so let's go to the chat. Martial law is coming, says Metal Mikoff. Patrick Butler says, spot on, alarmists are right, no matter what the outcome. If fatalities are few, it's because of their policy. If not, it's because not enough was done. Brandon Smith says, China issued a 10-step propaganda how-to manual saying just that a week ago. Well, yes, I touched on this a day or two ago. I was talking about the failures of socialism. As Malcolm Muggeridge said in the talk that I referred to, that he found it very amusing that the failures of socialism were met with a demand for more socialism. And that kept going until socialism collapsed. Curiously, Paul Gottfried has pointed this out at book length, that after the fall of the Berlin Wall and dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, socialism was completely discredited. But then these very same people turned on a dime and said, for socialism, we're not into that anymore. We have something new for you. Oh, yes? It's called multiculturalism. And you're all going to have to get behind multiculturalism because it's good for you. It's good for everybody. And if you don't, you're a wicked person. Just forget about the fact that we were the people who were extolling socialism and its virtues for decades. We were also doing everything that we could to minimize the horrors of socialist communist countries because, you know, their hearts were in the right place. Lecomte de Boreas says there is no doctor on planet Earth who would agree with this horseshit politics of general panic. I don't know about that, because that's what we seem to be getting from the sainted Dr. Anthony Fauci. To give one example, he says, plandemic is working, no tsunami of death. Well, I have been using this hashtag plandemic because there are forces at work here. Exactly what they want? Well, we have clues. We have some clues. I have suggested that since with the aging of the population, the current pension and healthcare system threatens to overwhelm the economy, particularly the government's ability to pay for all this. So we might see quickly radical changes in these things. Let's see. Trust your inner child. They remember what the correct action was pre-indoctrination. Okay, we going to get pandemics every year. We've always had them. Yes, that is absolutely true. People think an epidemic means that the bodies are being stacked up like cordwood. That is not, in fact, what an epidemic means. And epidemics are frequent. So, yes, but yes, the funny thing, see, this is the novel coronavirus. It's new, and therefore it is unlike any other form of influenza that has ever existed. So pay attention, people. What's on the menu is totalitarianism. Brandon Smith says, until boomer celebs start dropping, it's hard to take seriously. Celebs, some horrible gay playwright, Terrence McNally, a just loathsome fellow. He died at the age of 81 a couple of weeks ago. Just yesterday or the day before, this fellow who played Bill, who was the beloved head of the cruise division, Waystar Royco on Succession, he died. But of course, these men were very old. Let's see, Brandon Smith, practice social distancing, which is literally physical distancing, unless they're subliminally preaching that people practice be antisocial, which could backfire and turn into practicing anti-socialism. Well, you know, as I've mentioned before, this social distancing has been what the elite has been in favor of for quite some time, because life has no purpose. People are just atoms. It's a stochastic universe. And we are all atoms seeking to maximize our own utility. And interactions with other people that are not transactional, and particularly those that are random, have no place in this brave new world. The whole Bugman ethos is based on this. Oh, do you know how many different kinds of food I can have delivered to my apartment? Do you know that there is no reason for me ever to leave my apartment? Now, normal people would consider this to be a kind of jailing almost, because man is a social animal. But the elite has been telling us that man is, in fact, a transactional animal. And if there's no transaction involved, why are you doing it? Now, this was well underway before the internet, before broadband, but the rise of social media, it really took off. And you see, look at how the media has decided to anoint the bug man as the highest form of humanity. Yes, Half Galician says it's pronounced Fauci. Yes, you're absolutely right. Mea culpa. Okay. Oh, it means jaws in Italian, says Quacha Lango. That fellow who was the whistleblower, the so-called whistleblower, and I can't mention his name or YouTube will shut down this stream like that. Curiously, his name means bagpipe in English. The fellow had an Italian name. So let's get back to the show. And apparently there's some activity with the models. The models are what we use to determine policy. Not really rational thought, not consideration, not on the one hand this, on the other hand that. You run a bunch of data through a black box, and then the data tells you exactly what to do. Well, there's an ancient phrase in IT, which I'm sure everyone knows, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. Could UK coronavirus deaths be lower than feared? If Britain follows China's trajectory, only 5,700, not 20,000, are expected to die, and the peak will be a week on Sunday, experts say. Well, how about that? A paper by Imperial College London has predicted that if the country follows the same trajectory as China, it could see between 4,700 and 7,100 deaths. And the peak of the outbreak, which could see between 210 and 230 people die in a single day, could happen next Sunday on April the 5th. Now, this is considerably lower than the 20,000, the doomsday scenario from Professor Neil Ferguson of Imperial College. He warned that tens of thousands could die if people weren't forced to stay at home. Now, you will remember, we talked about this on last night's show, that so Ferguson, he's responsible for the doomsday model, And then he confessed that this is thousands of lines of unexamined or uncorrected or unnoted C code written 13 plus years ago, which he has refused to release. But this new projection from Imperial, developed by engineer Professor Tom Pike, compared 8 countries' death rates to China's after Beijing put the nation into shutdown. More than 1 billion people worldwide are now in some form of lockdown, as the number of confirmed coronavirus patients has soared past 500,000. Confirmed coronavirus patients. Well, as I was saying, with H1N1 in the United States, over 60 million people had the virus. It said that the almost entire world population, 7 billion citizens, could have been infected if the virus was allowed to spread unchecked. Curiously, that's pretty much what was said about AIDS. Now, 60 million people with H1N1 is roughly 1/5 of the U.S. population, and there were over 12,000 deaths. Oh, here we go. 40 million could have died without lockdowns. You see, I don't like making short-term predictions because there's too many variables involved, but I made one about coronavirus, and it has turned out to be true, and it's come true earlier than I thought. You see, how many people have been exposed to coronavirus? How many people have coronavirus? We have no figures on this. We have absolutely no reliable figures on this. As that fellow was mentioning to Peter Hitchens yesterday, to test ill people or deathly ill people for coronavirus is rather similar to testing people for alcoholism, and you're only testing those people that you find in a pub on Tuesday afternoon. But the elite has saved us. That is the message. Hooray for the elite. Now, the latest numbers from Canada, just slightly over 4,000 confirmed cases, 39 deaths. 14 of those in British Columbia, and 11 of those deaths from one old age home in Lynn Valley, British Columbia, where a staff nurse, infected everybody there after basic health protocols were ignored. In New Brunswick, they're talking about, everything's going to be shut down for months, maybe 18 months. That's what the chief health officer of that province said. 33 cases, 0 deaths. Are you getting it yet? So I've been looking for the latest figures from Vancouver Island, and they don't seem to have been updated today, at least not reported. But as of yesterday, 52 cases on the entire island and 0 deaths. And yet the totalitarianism is pretty much as strong here as it is elsewhere in the West. The streets are largely deserted, that if you find yourself walking down the sidewalk and, oh my God, there's someone coming towards you, typically someone will walk out into the highway rather than pass within 3 feet of another person. The panic is the thing. COVID-19 has now killed more people in Canada than SARS. It seems to me like sports. Z-Man was using this sports analogy, and we've surpassed SARS. How does this compare to MERS? How does it compare to H1N1? Come on, team. We can do better. The BC health officials preparing for worst-case COVID-19 scenario. I think that we touched on that yesterday. But how about our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who is being praised in the Canadian media, which is bought and paid for twice now? His wife has the coronavirus, or so we are told. And apparently she also infected Idris, what's his name? Idris Elba, the actor. And so, according to David Aiken of Global News, chief political correspondent of Global News, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says his doctors have told him to stay in self-isolation. This is his 16th consecutive day in self-isolation. Quote, "I'm happy to do this," unquote. You see, Trudeau was eligible to come out of isolation yesterday, and the question was he going to? What kind of message would that send to the nation? And it turns out that this little quote here or this characterization from David Aiken, chief political correspondent of Global News, is fake news. Here's a story from CTV News today. PM Trudeau plans to keep working at home. Here is the direct quotation. "The doctors continue to tell us to stay in self-isolation. But at the same time, we're asking Canadians to work from home wherever possible. We're asking people to stay self-isolated as much as possible, to not go out if not necessary. And I'm happy to continue to do this." You see, Trudeau did not say that his doctors told him to stop self-isolating. He said the doctors continue to tell us to stay in self-isolation. You see, Trudeau's position is rather different than most of us. Despite the fact that Parliament has been shut down, Trudeau continues to draw his salary regardless of what he does. Whether, he's working diligently at his home or whether he's on the couch, watching Office reruns on Netflix. Story from Hamilton. Fake coronavirus doctor's notes from worker closed Hamilton McDonald's. An 18-year-old Hamilton woman is facing 4 charges after police say she faked having coronavirus to get out of work. She just didn't want to go to work, Hamilton Police Constable Lorraine Edwards said. With the magnitude of what's happening in the world today, COVID-19, and the seriousness of what we're all having to deal with, this particular incident definitely needed to have police attention. Well, yeah, I suppose so. And now we're into the fantasy realm here. Another story from Global News. Canadian unemployment could hit 15%. It's currently about 5%. Amid coronavirus pandemic, deficit to $113 billion. A deficit of $113 billion in Canada is, it's unthinkable. It's absolutely unthinkable. Where would Canada possibly get the money to fund a deficit like that? Canadian debt, will be in junk territory. It's inconceivable, absolutely inconceivable. Just the assumption is that, the deficit is just going to balloon, by 80 billion or so, 80, 90 billion or so. This is while the economy has been turned off. So at some point in the future, nobody knows when and no one's in any hurry, we're just going to flip a switch and the economy is going to start roaring again. Is it now? How about all those businesses, small businesses who shut, or been forced to shut? People are, going to lose their lease. They're going to lose their savings. Many of them are not going to be in a position to start up their businesses again. Andrew Coyne made a fatuous comparison to World War II. Everyone's just in love with World War II now. Ooh, all of the death and destruction and chaos. Ooh, those were exciting times, weren't they? The thing is that during World War II, in Canada, the United States, Britain, this was a full employment economy. In fact, the demand for employment was so great that vast numbers of women were integrated into the workforce. And it's a funny thing about wars is they have unintended consequences. Feminism is to a very large degree the result of changes that were wrought by World War I and World War II. So when the Allies won World War II, it was a question of taking a certain type of production and switching to a different type of production. It wasn't a situation where 15, 20, 25% of the population or more was out of work. Oh, our valiant civil servants. So this woman in Hamilton is going to be charged because she faked coronavirus. We have a mutiny at Service Canada. The federal government is shutting the doors to all of its 317 Service Canada centres where people can apply in person for unemployment insurance, old age security, pension benefits, and passports on Friday after employees en masse refused to work. The government meant to pressure Thursday evening from the Canadian Employment and Immigration Union, which represents 17,000 Service Canada employees, including 3,360 who staff the centres. Many had called in sick or refused to work because they didn't feel safe during the coronavirus pandemic, despite safe distancing measures put in place that kept the centres open. The centres were crowded, and efforts to control the traffic resulted in long lines outside and sometimes irate visitors. In recent days, so many missed work that 187 centres closed on Thursday, almost 60% of the network. Well, again, just as it seems to me that being a policeman involves accepting a certain degree of danger, it seems to me that being a public servant of this kind involves an agreement to accept a certain amount of contact with the public. Obviously, people who work in places like this are already more susceptible to germs and viruses than other people, simply because of the number of people that they come into contact with. Ahmed Hussein, he is the admitted illegal immigrant from Somalia. This is where we recruit our political talent in Canada now. He's the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development, said Canadians will still be able to access their benefits online and over the phone. This will allow more Canadians to get the support they need while better protecting both them and our staff. Well, maybe they'll just close Services Canada. You know, the banks decided they didn't want people going to banks anymore, and so you can use the ATM machines. But make sure you use one of our machines or we'll force you to pay a fee. Yeah, but you're saving an enormous amount of money in closing the branches. Why are you charging fees? Well, that's our business, and it's easier for us. See, people don't need the personal touch anymore. Everything that's important in life can be done over the internet now. I was talking about the pandemic. What are the goals? Well, we see some of it in the financial sector, which is, I guess that big companies that are too big to fail, like Boeing, they must always be made whole. I suggested we may see big changes in long-term care for the elderly and perhaps with pensions. But here is something a little bolder, a little more redolent of Agenda 21, which, okay, don't worry about that. It's in no way a sinister anti-human conspiracy. This is from Open Democracy, and it is from Sophie Lewis. The coronavirus crisis shows it's time to abolish the family. At the time of writing, humankind has well and truly entered the time of corona. In the hopes of flattening the curve of the pandemic, vast swaths of society have adopted contagion slowing practices, be they mandatory, voluntary, or semi-voluntary, known as social distancing and sheltering in place. Certainly, there have been eco-fascist sentiments that calls for authoritarian state control over the situation. Well, that's exactly what we've got. But mutual aid has also proliferated. Grocery runs and disinfection supplies for the immunocompromised, childcare and safe injection kits for sex workers, the most important of all our workers, and substance users. And don't forget the contributions that substance users make to the GDP. Copay waivers, etc., etc., etc. Nuclear households, it seems, are where we are all intuitively expected to retreat in order to prevent widespread ill health. Staying home is what is somehow self-evidently supposed to keep us well. But there are several problems with this, as anyone inclined to think about it critically might figure out. Problems one might summarize as the mystification of the couple form. from the romanticization of kinship and the sanitization of the fundamentally unsafe space that is private property. Whoa, communism. Is that what we want? Obviously, private property is a far more safe space than public property. When one sends one's children to school, one is exposing one's children to hundreds or possibly, in high schools, thousands of others, thousands of strangers. That doesn't sound like a very safe space to me. How can a zone defined by the power asymmetries of housework? Yes, Stephen Kotkin, in his biography of Stalin, makes much of Bolshevik speak. And here we are in Bolshevik speak. It never really went away. It was defined as, anti-homophobia, anti-misogyny, anti-racism, gender queer, gender lens, etc., etc. Bolshevism speak, it's still very much with it. Reproductive labor being so gendered. Yeah. As childbirth is especially gendered, seeing as that there's only, one sex of the two that can give birth to children. The World Health Organization calls domestic violence the most widespread, but among the least reported human rights abuses. That is not what is considered to be a human rights abuse, certainly not traditionally. Oh, get this. Queer and feminized people, especially very old and very young ones, are definitionally not safe there. Their flourishing in the capitalist home is the exception, not the rule. Are you kidding me? Woke capital has been telling us gay, 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 gay. Oh, and alphabet to trans people. Oh, wow. You know about that RuPaul? Well, was he like the third most admired person in America now? How can we get trans people into everything? And by the way, trans women are better women than, cis women, because they have to be, because I am sure I could figure it out. You give me 5 minutes, but I don't have 5 minutes. So it follows that upon closer inspection, both terms, social distancing and sheltering in place, appear remarkable as much for what they don't say. That is, what they presume and naturalize as what they do. Sheltering in what place and in whose? Distance from whom, or everyone but whom? Yeah, so we're going to see some sort of commie takeover, the final assault on the family. Oh, wow. Households are capitalism's pressure cookers. This crisis will see a surge in housework. Cleaning, cooking, caretaking, but also child abuse, molestation, intimate partner rape, psychological torture, and more. Far from a time to acquiesce to family values ideology, then, the pandemic is an acutely important time to provision, evacuate, and generally empower survivors of and refugees from the nuclear household. What? Yes. And thirdly, even when the private nuclear household poses no direct physical or mental threat to one's person, no spouse battering, no child rape, and no queer bashing, the private family qua mode of social reproduction still frankly sucks. It genders, nationalizes, and races us. You see, people didn't have genders or sexes until this was forced upon them. People didn't have nations until this was forced upon them. People didn't have races until this was forced upon them. This is what the clever clogs of today believe. So it would appear that the folks at Open Democracy, they think that social revolution, the final victory in the social revolution, is at hand, and I suppose they could be right. From ProPublica, how China built a Twitter propaganda machine, then let it loose on coronavirus. ProPublica analyzed thousands of fake and hijacked Twitter accounts to understand how covert Chinese propaganda spreads around the globe. Well, this could be one of the good things that comes from coronavirus, is an acknowledgement that it is not Russia that is a threat to us. It is China. And perhaps we'll do something about it. I, myself, am looking forward to show trials of the collaborators, of the fifth columnists in our midst. So what's happening in the markets? Well, the Dow was down 915 points, just over 4%, but it was still up for the week. The VIX, the Frady Cat Index, was up 7.4%. U.S. cases topped 100,000. Airlines warned government aid not a cure for coronavirus travel plunge. Airbnb freezes hiring, suspends marketing due to coronavirus. It's not going to survive. Airbnb not going to survive. Fiorina criticizes coronavirus relief bill, says large companies haven't earned stepped. That would be Carlton Fiorina. She ran for president. Didn't make much of it. I call her that because as far as I've been able to tell, that actually is her given name, Carlton, and not Carly. As one might imagine, James Kunstler is quite exercised by what is unfolding. He writes today, historians of the future pan-roasting fresh-caught June bugs over the campfires may wonder when exactly was the moment when the financial world broke with reality. Was it when Nixon slammed the gold window shut? When Maestro Alan Greenspan first bamboozled the Senate Finance Committee? When Pets.com face-planted 268 days after its IPO? When the Ben Bernanke declared the housing bubble contained? If our reality is a world of human activity, then finance is now completely divorced from it for the obvious reason that for now, there is no human activity. Everyone except the doctors and nurses and some government officials is locked down. So the only other thing actually still out there, spinning its wheels, is finance. And to those of us watching from solitary confinement, it is looking more and more like an IMAX scale hallucination with Dolby sound. How many mortals can even pretend to understand the transactions now taking place among Treasury and banking officials? On their own terms, TALFs, special purpose vehicles, commercial paper funding facilities, repo rescue operations, helicopter money. These stand as increasingly empty jargon phrases to signify increasingly futile efforts to paper over the essence of the situation. The world is bankrupt. It's that simple. The world is locked down and in hock up to its eyeballs. It faces what the bankers euphemistically call a workout, which is to say a restructuring. The folks in charge are resisting that workout with all their might because it will change many of the conditions of everyday life, especially theirs. But it is coming anyway. When debt can't be paid back, money vanishes. Money isn't capital, but it represents capital when it is functioning. When it isn't functioning, it stops being money. Now the whole world realizes that the debt can't be paid back, will never be paid back, and that the jig is up. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet is the black hole in the financial universe where money goes to die. Money is rushing in there at a fantastic rate these days, and the Fed is trying to spew out new money at an equal rate to replace it, raising the question, is it even money anymore, or just a figment in the larger hallucination? Kind of seems that way a little bit. They brought out their biggest money-launching bazookas only a few days ago, and it may only be a few days more before that gigantic salvo proves inadequate. What then? Perhaps the key is how long the ordinary folk agree to their orderly confinement, even in the fear of the coronavirus. That moment may be a bit further out, with the melodrama mounting, especially in New York City right now, numbers of sick people going all hockey stick, and frightful scenes in the hospitals. But then, whether it's a week from now or Easter Sunday or sometime after that, what will the ordinary folk do when they decide en masse to deconfine and come roaring out into the streets? I must imagine that one vignette will feature a mob of inflamed, formerly middle-class Long Islanders swarming into the Hamptons with blood in their eyes for the hedge funders, cringing in their majestic show places, who will discover with maximum chagrin that privet hedge is no hedge at all against the wrath of the plebes. There has never been a bigger swindle in history than the aggregate shenanigans on Wall Street, lo, these years of the new millennium, and we all know it, even if it's hard to explain just how they did it. The money boys should be taking a haircut and a half now instead of wailing for bailouts, but such is the perversity of human greed that they made one last desperate attempt to nail down their fortunes when everybody else was losing everything. You understand that banking and finance was headed firmly south long before coronavirus stole onto the scene. The tremors started back in September with the Fed jamming untold trillions into the black hole that had opened in overnight lending between banks. That was an infection too, and boy did it spread as fast as coronavirus. This is indeed a most unfortunate convergence of events, but it should tell you that the banking and finance system and the global economic arrangements that evolved with it had already passed their event horizon. History had punched our ticket and was embarking us on a journey whether we were ready or not. It is a comfort to know that Joe Biden waits patiently on the sidelines to wave his aviator glasses and make everything normal again. I don't think so. Mr. Trump, for all the awe of his office, is not much better positioned to turn about the ship we're sailing on. Rough seas ahead in uncharted waters as we seek landfall in the next new world. Now, when one considers the idea of a pandemic, it's possible that the Wall Street boys decided that this is our last chance to be made whole, for the big score, that it's all coming apart. And we're going to make the argument, which we have made again and again, certainly going back to the Mexican bailout in 1994, that you had better make us whole. That is to say, allow us to profit for our stupid practices, for our stupid and often grossly irresponsible, even criminal decisions, or bad things will happen. And it could be that, they'd simply realize that the system was falling apart, so they had better cash out now. It's also possible that we're looking at what Tainter wrote about in his Collapse of Complex Societies, that the financial society, its ecosystem, if you will, is become so complex that one needs an increasing amount of inputs simply to keep still, running in place. Eventually, as Tainter explains in his book, which I discussed on the book club some months ago, eventually collapsing societies reach a point where it doesn't matter how many inputs there are into it, it is not enough. And that may well be where we are now. Let's go back to the chat. Eternal Fisherman says, Russian RT allies itself with the new left, though. I agree that there was a time when Russia showed goodwill, but nowadays they play the cynical media war game too. Brandon Smith says the mass revelation of Stockholm Syndrome hasn't even intensified. Chogan Kin 666, people were sunbathing in the park today. Well, I'm glad to hear it. I really am glad to hear it because, again, I don't want to hear anybody ever again talk about, the German people during the 1930s and the 1940s. Oh, why didn't they stand up to Hitler? Oh, so we're told that there's this virus, and okay, are the bodies stacking up like cordwood? No, they're not, but they will. They will. And so that means we have to have totalitarian society. Also, the big companies, the big Wall Street boys, the hedge fund traders, they have to be made even richer. Okay, sure. What exactly were we threatened with? I made this point for many years. It's all very well to talk about the cowardice of people in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, but who exactly has been holding a gun to our heads for the last few decades? That, you must march in the Pride Parade. Why? Is someone going to shoot me if I don't? Am I going to be arrested? Am I going to be taken to Dachau or to the Lubyanka? Am I going to be sent to the Gulag if I don't march in the Pride Parade? No, we must march in the Pride Parade because people would think that we are mean. Ben S says, KMG, your channel is getting no love on YouTube, no notification, no on my subs, nothing. Yes, many people have complained about this. All right, money as mind control. Let's see, from coup attempt to hero. Brendan Smith says the massive indebtedness going forward, going to seriously enhance the leader's ability to lean on the borrowers to implement agenda. Well, it occurred to me some years ago that this debt is never going to be paid back. And, Kunstler makes a good point. What exactly constitutes money anymore? I would have thought, after 2008, that it would have been pretty simple, for President Bush or President Obama to say, before Wall Street gets a penny from us, there are things that are going to happen. These financial instruments, these things that you got drunk on, we're shutting all this down. We're shutting all this down. All the derivatives, canceled. They're going to be canceled, and you are not going to be allowed to do that again. Oh, and by the way, we're dividing up banking again. If you want to play the system like a casino, do it with your own private money. Do not use it with shareholders' deposits. That's not what they're there for. Basically, undo all of the deregulation that allowed the 1% to flourish, that allowed the 1% essentially to turn us into slaves. But that didn't happen. Idris not so Alba. Yeah, okay. I got his name wrong, it would seem. So let's get back to what is going on. And oh yes, so what's gonna die because of coronavirus? I mean, aside from people, the nuclear family, perhaps. How about higher education? How about artistic higher education? Here's a story from NBC New York. New York University Tisch students demand tuition back. Dean responds with dance video. Students at New York University Tisch School of the Arts want some of their tuition money back because they say virtual classes aren't what they paid for. But instead of addressing the situation, the school's dean sent them a video of herself dancing to REM's Losing My Religion. Following several communications between students and the school administration, Dean Allison Green, and Allison is not spelled anything like you would imagine Allison to be spelled, earlier this week attached her dance video to an email to students in which she explained that she doesn't have the authority to refund tuition, that it's challenging for the school to give students their money back right now. I wonder what their endowment is. I watched the video, and here you have this middle-aged woman, I guess her to be in her 50s. She's dancing, if you could call it that. I could do as well as that. Any of you could do as well as that. A year's tuition at Tisch costs about $58,552. It's arguably a lot more when you consider other fees, and most of the students at the private and prestigious art school require hands-on education. The school informed students that it would not be reimbursing tuition fees, even though they were forced to move to remote learning due to the spread of COVID-19. Does the world need the Tisch School? How did the world manage to come up with artists before the rise of institutions such as the Tisch School? Is this what they call essential work? Is it? I mean, seriously, these students are, say, $58,000, but it's probably more like $70,000 to $80,000 a year, all in. And is it sustainable? I'll go back to my theory of the surplus of capitalism. That capitalism, up until 2008, okay, the Austrians are going to argue that there has been no growth in productivity since the 1970s. It's all credit. Yeah, I buy that largely. But this became manifest. I mean, it couldn't be ignored after 2008 that the surplus created by capitalism was gone. The surplus, well, it paid for gender studies, and it paid for the Tisch School, and it paid for performance art, and it paid for a shark, a bisected shark floating in a tank of formaldehyde, all that sort of thing. Boeing to emerge as big stimulus winner, says the Wall Street Journal. Okay, so take a great American company, drive it into the ground, and get rich doing it. Sounds pretty good. doesn't it? Boeing, a company, is set to emerge as the big winner of the coronavirus stimulus package, even if the aerospace giant declines to seek direct taxpayer help. The company had lobbied for at least $60 billion for itself and its vast supplier network to blunt the blow of the pandemic that has paralyzed global airline traffic and reduced demand for passenger aircraft. The prospect of canceled orders and airlines unable to take new planes added to the pressure on Boeing from the continuing crisis around the grounding since last year of its 737 MAX jets, which has already sent its debt soaring as it borrowed to compensate customers and support suppliers. Yeah, maybe you shouldn't have got $9 an hour coders from India. You know, put them to write the code for this very, very complex system. Maybe you shouldn't have done that, Boeing. Maybe the United States government should not have allowed the endless series of mergers that results in companies like Boeing being too big to fail. Perhaps as a condition of any kind of bailout, Boeing should be broken up. There's all sorts of companies in the United States that should be broken up. I mean, I'd start with Disney, myself, Facebook, Google, etc., etc. But no, there's just this rush to throw money to people. Politico, who got special deals in the stimulus and why they got them? Let's see. Senator Patrick Leahy, a Democrat from Vermont, managed to successfully push a minimum assistance figure for every state, $1.5 billion, to make sure small states like his weren't left out. A provision for the FDA to approve innovative sunscreens, which would benefit L'Oreal, which has operations in Kentucky, appeared in the bill, which was steered in the Senate by Majority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky. Aides to McConnell said, however, that he did not push for the provision. Is this the point where we really get the peasants with the pitchforks? That this is supposed to be an emergency bill to save a country and its people, which is threatened. Never mind that it's threatened by a bogus situation. Never mind that. I mean, the virus, the disaster of the virus may be a hoax, but the consequences are real in the same way that AIDS was largely a hoax, but the consequences were real there too. So yeah, let's help out L'Oreal. Why? Do you people have absolutely no shame? The gaming industry wasn't left out either. Casinos will be able to tap government loans for disaster assistance, a payback after casinos were blocked from receiving tax breaks extended to other businesses after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The gaming business is wicked. Oh, it provides all of these jobs. Yes, it provides all of these jobs by impoverishing people, by bankrupting people. You can say that they're stupid people. That is beside the point. Travel agents. Do travel agents still exist? But they're getting relief. Oh, better, faster sunscreen. What? Equity for small states, job security for military brass. The rescue package permits Trump to extend the terms of up to 7 senior military leaders. A win for the credit reporting industry. Student tax loan boon, casinos roll the dice and win, free video visitation in prison. Harbor dredging help, relief for farmers. Okay. Video, free video for prisoners. Okay, you can see how that is essential. Airlines warn government aid not a cure for coronavirus travel plunge. United and Delta say they will not furlough or cut the pay of its U.S. workers through September 30th, as outlined in a government aid package. Yeah. So, yeah, they're just going to fire people anyway. Delta is asking for more volunteers to take unpaid leave after close to a quarter of the carrier's employees raised their hands. How about the executives going on unpaid leave? How about shareholders, big shareholders within the company selling a lot of those shares? so that people employed by the company can continue to be paid. AOC, that would be Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, rips Republicans because the coronavirus stimulus bill doesn't include cash payments to illegal immigrants. To clarify, $1,200 checks are only going to some with Social Security numbers, not immigrants with tax IDs. Again, I guess these people, they're not afraid of any kind of reckoning. Not at all. They have their favorite groups, and you got to shovel money to them. Obviously illegal immigrants are a tremendous burden on legal Americans, but I guess they are useful to AOC. So there was this fellow called Massey, Thomas Massey, a representative from Kentucky, who was famous for, a day or so. It doesn't look like he's going to be famous for much longer. Trump rages against third-rate GOP congressman for threatening to block stimulus. Throw him out of the Republican Party. He just wants the publicity, Trump said. He can't stop it, only delay, which is both dangerous and costly. The whole purpose of legislative assemblies is to have the ability to debate measures such as this bailout. It's an emergency. We can't talk about it. No. If you want to argue for a strong man on a white horse, Napoleon, if you want to argue for a dictator, then go ahead. But we have to pass this bill right now, regardless of what's in it. And of course, we don't know what's in it because the bill, last time I checked, was 1,400 pages long. I believe it was Nancy Pelosi who said a few years ago, you have to pass the bill to know what's in it. It's at this point, it becomes clear that the Democratic government has become an utter joke. We had some bipartisan piling on from John Kerry, 2004 Democratic presidential nominee. Breaking news, Congressman Massey has tested positive for being an asshole. He must be quarantined to prevent the spread of his massive stupidity. He's given new meaning to the term masshole. Finally, something the president and I can agree on. Yes, you have the stupid party and the wicked party, as Sam Francis says. And when the stupid and the wicked party get together to shaft the people, they call it bipartisanship. Oh, okay, Thomas Massey again. He seems to be yesterday's man. Things are moving so quickly today that I spent, a fair amount of time. Oh, I have to find out about this Thomas Massey fellow. I have to aggregate all of these stories about Thomas Massey, and then everything moved on, and he is no longer relevant. Never let a crisis go to waste, from Jacobin Mag. For 6 years, Emmanuel Macron has worked to get rid of the 35-hour work week and worker protections from unfair dismissal. Today, his government is using the coronavirus lockdown as a pretext to push ahead with the agenda and allow bosses to unilaterally undermine labor conditions. Last Monday evening, Emmanuel Macron gave a 30-minute televised address on COVID-19. We are at war, Macron declared solemnly, a declaration he was to repeat a further 5 times in the course of his speech. The nation was exhorted to present a united front against the viral enemy and to show civic-mindedness in confinement. But the moralizing, patriotic discourse deployed by the government, amplified by many commentators, occludes the reality of a crisis exacerbated by decades of conscious policy decisions. All of this talk about war reminds me of Paul Verhoeven's brilliant satire, Starship Troopers, which has little to do with Heinlein's source novel. And, the bugs, we hate the bugs, we've got to kill the bugs. And you see school children, they're doing their part, stomping on the bugs. Would you want to learn more? But it turns out that the bugs are real. The space bugs are real, and the space bugs are deadly. We're engaging in this pathetic fallacy with regard to coronavirus, that we're going to start shaking our fist in defiance at the virus? Is that what's going to happen? Oh, in Britain. Britain seems to have embraced totalitarianism with more alacrity than any other Western nation. According to the Mail, the government is mauled over coronavirus testing failures as the disease strikes down Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Cabinet Ministers Matt Hancock and Chris Whitty, the three men leading the country's response to the killer virus. Now all of Westminster is wondering who is next. I don't want to appear cynical. Anyone can say that they have the coronavirus. And if they say they have the coronavirus, this is going to be met with a great deal of sympathy from the general public. We know that celebrities, and politicians are now celebrities, they're treated as such. Celebrities routinely make up diseases. It is now very fashionable for celebrities with drug and alcohol problems to claim that they are suffering from Lyme disease. I'm a little suspicious about this. I'm a little suspicious of all the celebrities, the show business celebrities, who say they have coronavirus, and of the political celebrities who claim that they have coronavirus. I mean, it's quite a good bargaining chip. You know, you must do what I say. Do you want me to die? Actually, politicians shouldn't ask that question of the public, because increasingly they're going to get an answer that they didn't expect. What? Totalitarian news. Oh, TV star James May ignores official government advice and enjoys a cozy pint at the pub with friends last night, 24 hours after urging everyone to stay at home due to coronavirus. James May, he was with Top Gear, and he's with that Amazon show now. It's called The Great Something or Other, that followed Top Gear. So his decision to join others outside the Cross Keys in Hammersmith, West London, came a day after he posted a video on Instagram urging people to stay at home, because that's what we all have to do now. You see, these celebrities, they learn what they're expected to say. Do you think all of these people in Hollywood really care about PETA? No, they don't. A few of them do. It's just that, apparently I have to support PETA. Eating animals is wrong. Wearing their skin or their fur is wrong. Sure, I'll say that. I want to fit in. May insisted he hadn't done anything wrong, as the pub wasn't officially open and he was only helping drink up beer that would have gone to waste. It's all very ecologically sound. The pub had an advertising board outside which said it was open between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. This has been removed this morning. Okay, so what else we got here? If you don't do this, there will be anarchy. Now, police officer threatens to fine shopkeeper for criminal damage after she drew social distancing markers in chalk outside her bakery, as forces across the country flex their new coronavirus lockdown powers. A Metropolitan Police officer threatened to punish a London bakery owner for trying to maintain distance between customers. I thought that's what they were supposed to be doing. Police facing accusations of overzealousness as officers crack down on people flouting coronavirus lockdown. Lawyers warned police unlawfully restricting people traveling to isolated spots to exercise and walk dogs. Neath Port Talbot Council, that's in Wales, I believe, is now using drones equipped with speakers to shout at groups of people outside. They are really pushing it. Really, really pushing it. How much can you put people through before they revolt? Well, I guess we're going to find out in Britain. Some Targeted claim they had been waiting hours for prescriptions before they were ordered to go home. Yeah. You're killing people. Moment police officer shouts at man walking down the street while claiming to have coronavirus. That was from Scotland. Why people are panic buying toilet paper during the coronavirus crisis. Pandemic expert says a heightened sense of disgust at dirt and germs during outbreaks fuels the behavior. Toilet paper has become a conditioned symbol of safety during the pandemic. People subconsciously see toilet paper as a good luck charm, keeping them safe. It's also linked to our ability to avoid disgusting things, said Dr. Stephen Taylor at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Taylor has released a book called The Psychology of Pandemics before the outbreak was first identified in Wuhan. In a pandemic, people are more likely to experience the emotion of disgust and are more motivated to avoid it. In psychology research, this hoarding of things like toilet paper is called a conditioned safety signal. It's almost like a good luck charm or a way of keeping safe. Okay. And apparently people are drinking more. And yeah, that's a problem because from Agence France Presse, another video conference happy hour, I'm going to end up an alcoholic. At the office, I can't go downstairs to smoke over every little annoyance, but working from home, nobody knows. Yes, there are moves afoot to ban people from in private residences from smoking because that isn't smoking tobacco, that is an unapproved recreation, unlike, say, smoking marijuana, which for some reason is very much approved. Whether they are tongue-in-cheek comments or anxious existential questions, testimonials of this kind are now rife on social media. With more than 3 billion people around the world living under lockdown, is it likely many people could turn to addiction while in corona's confinement? Maybe the authorities should have thought of this possibility before they decided to lock down half the world. The links between traumatic stress and drug use are well established, said Philippe Battel, a psychiatrist at the Charente Addiction Center in France. People respond in the usual ways, such as painkillers, alcohol, and recreational drugs. Elsa Tascini, a psychologist and co-founder of an addiction association, says such a reaction can be expected even among people who do not suffer from an addiction. In a confined situation, most of the strategies for coping with stress, such as sport or going out, no longer exist, but there is more and more stress. And the coping strategy that is still available is the use of substances. In its recommendations for coping with stress during the pandemic, the World Health Organization advises, quote, don't use smoking, alcohol, or other drugs to deal with your emotions. And my response to the World Health Organization is shut the hell up. You are the people who said not to worry about coronavirus back in January. You were the people who said that it would be wrong to restrict flights from any part of the world. You were the people who said that the real problem with coronavirus was stigmatization. So, no, we don't care about what you say. From LifeSite, Cardinal bishops ban confession in response to coronavirus pandemic. Catholic shepherds, among them a cardinal and a growing number of bishops, are banning the sacrament of confession as a response to coronavirus. Diocese of Newark says that it's suspended until further notice, with the exception of an extreme emergency. All confessions canceled in the Diocese of London, Ontario, Indianapolis, etc., etc., etc. Catholics hold that the priest has the power to forgive all sins, acting as God's instrument of mercy. Confession is integral to Christian life since it cleanses one from deadly sins that would otherwise cut one off from God and the kingdom of heaven. For bishops to suspend confession on the presumption that Catholics in grave sin can achieve perfect contrition is to jeopardize the salvation of the souls under their care, says Dr. Peter Krasniewski, a Catholic philosopher and author. Yes, Easter is coming up. And the Catholic Church sees the most confessions in the weeks, or particularly the week or a few days before Christmas and Easter Sunday. Well, I guess if there's no confession, you're going to have many fewer people going to Mass. Well, this is assuming there is going to be Mass allowed on Easter Sunday. And if there was Mass, then you are not permitted to take communion without being shriven if you're in a state of mortal sin. But of course, the more we hear about this, the more obvious it becomes that they don't believe in any of it. As I said earlier this afternoon, the Catholic Church prelates are more afraid of coronavirus than they are of Almighty God. And I quoted from the book of Exodus, chapter 34, verse 14, "Never pay worship to any alien god. The very name of the Lord bespeaks jealous God. He will endure no rival." Let's see, Roberto Di Mattai writes, "The church is auto-persecuting its own members in a coronavirus pandemic." Well, Karl Rahner, he wanted a little flock, and the current Catholic Church has done much better. I mean, he went beyond Karl Rahner's wildest fantasies. They have got no flock now. And perhaps that will be another result of the coronavirus, that the Catholic Church will transition very quickly to a talking shop about climate change, how wonderful migrants are, the evils of misogyny, racism, et cetera, and leave all that spiritualism stuff behind. The jealous God, who's afraid of a jealous God? Well, the Catholic Church, the leaders of the Catholic Church certainly aren't any longer. The Jerusalem Post reports, "Why do some Christians believe coronavirus is an apocalyptic prophecy?" I should have thought that was fairly obvious. Christians have been celebrating Easter for almost 2,000 years. Christians were celebrating Easter in the catacombs for hundreds of years, and now it appears they are not going to be allowed to celebrate Easter. That certainly sounds like the apocalypse to me. Devout Christians have taken to social media in light of the coronavirus outbreak to show the eerie similarities between current events and the prophecy of the end of the world presented in the New Testament in the book of Revelation. The book describes a series of catastrophic events which will ravage the world, some perpetrated by the titular four horsemen of the apocalypse. Though the roles of these riders have multiple interpretations, they are often recognized as war, plague, famine, and death. Similarities between these descriptions and current events appear too similar for some to disregard, and they have taken to social media to declare that we are living at the end of days. Those who know nothing of the New Testament or about Armageddon might think this is the end of days, but it really isn't, said Jeff Keenley, a theology expert, told Mako. I'm not really keen on accepting the advice on theology by a man who styles himself Jeff. I'm afraid the end of the world is not known to us. It really isn't. That is one of the, we don't know when we're going to die individually, and we don't know when the world is going to come to an end. That's pretty much, that's doctrine, okay? But I suppose perhaps Jeff doesn't agree with that. Bruce Charlton has a piece explaining the evil of Birdemic totalitarianism in terms of the final triumph of Ahrimanic materialism. A few months ago, Amo Bowden wrote a satire on the climate change mania, interpreting it as aspiring to the triumph of materialism, with everything in life being reduced to measuring parts per million of carbon dioxide. It suddenly struck me that this is what has actually happened with the Birdemic response. What I see all around is that the whole of human life is being incrementally reduced to quantitative data concerning a virus. This is evil, but evil of a kind that most people, modern people, regard as good, which is why the triumph of evil has gone almost unnoticed. All of human society is being sacrificed to the demands of quantitative variables relating to the virus. The world is a prison. All are under house arrest and in curfew, without time limit, worsening by the day. Human health in general, human happiness, and nearly all the satisfactions of life, science, arts, sports, dancing, conversation, contact with nature, and beautiful places, is being sacrificed to control of the virus, that is to say, control of the humans who suffer it. All of humanity, basic, direct, loving human contact, marriages, families, friends, colleagues, all have been damaged and are apparently en route to being eliminated. Isolation is being stepwise imposed on tens of millions in ways that are rightly regarded as cruel and barbaric in prisons. All of medicine, and Charlton is a medical doctor, a former professor of epidemiology. All of medicine is being progressively reordered around the single cause of illness and death. Drugs are running out, operations have been canceled, cancer treatment has been stopped. Increasing difficulty even to meet a doctor and to get a diagnosis. All is reduced to the surveillance and control of a single disease. This, then, is the triumph of that kind of evil that Rudolf Steiner called Ahrimanic. More commonly, it is termed satanic, in that Satan is the term sometimes used for the devil in his strategic, logical, unhuman, bureaucratic role, cold, controlling, and constricting. This as contrasted with the devil as Lucifer, the fallen light bringer, a manifestation of animalic impulse, short-termist selfishness, cruelty, and lust. Ahrimanic evil is modern evil, materialism, positivism, scientism. It is life being reduced to the measurable and quantifiable, and everything else denied and eliminated. It is happening because that is the mindset of modern, godless, spirit-denying man. It is happening at the request of such modern men, at their demand, indeed. The mass of people are, by their actions, actively seeking to have this single-issue world imposed upon them because from where they view the world, nothing else matters. If only they and theirs can avoid getting this specific virus and dying of the birdemic, then nothing else matters enough to save it from destruction. They will burn the whole world to be safe from the corvids. And this is seen as ethical, as indeed the only moral way to behave. And anybody objecting to this reduction of human life on Earth to the demands of a virus is hated, feared, and resented. This, then, is the triumph of Satan in this world. And on the subject of evil, I am going to switch now to the book club. And we are discussing today a book from 2017, which is the second volume of Stephen Kotkin's biography of Joseph Stalin, and it is subtitled Waiting for Hitler, 1928 to 1941. Now, when completed, this book will be close to, 5,000 pages and 3 volumes? Well, there was so much that was eventful in Stalin's life in the Soviet Union, Russia, and then the Soviet Union during Stalin's life, and throughout Europe and the rest of the world. And this book is more than a biography of Stalin. It is to a large extent kind of political biography of Europe in the first half of the 20th century. Stephen Kotkin was born in 1959. He was a graduate of the University of Rochester, and then got his MA and PhD at UCal Berkeley in history. He has been regularly to the Soviet Union and then Russia as a visiting scholar. He joined Princeton in 1989, and he is now professor in history and international affairs at Princeton, and he's also associated with the Hoover Institution. He has pretty much devoted his academic life to a study of the Soviet Union, and he has a book called Magnetic Mountain: Stalinism as a Civilization, which exposes the reality of everyday life in the Soviet city of Magnitogorsk during the 1930s. I would guess that Kotkin's politics are pretty centrist or centrist left. That's just a guess. He seems to, for instance, when writing about the Spanish Civil War, he has a very low opinion of the nationalists, the supporters of Franco. He refers repeatedly to them as putschists. But he is resolutely fair, and he observes what others have observed, the strangeness of Stalin's regime, because there have been plenty of regimes that have killed their opponents. Hitler certainly did. I mean, Hitler murdered his opponents, or those who who he perceived to be his opponents, or those who were his opponents, by class, say, or by race, like the Jews. But you see something very different with Stalin. You see a man declaring war on his own country. That the decision to collectivize agriculture in the Soviet Union, to smash the so-called kulaks, who were mostly small landholders with a few animals. I don't know whether it's the sort of decision that a sane man would have made. And it was simply an extraordinary gamble for two reasons. The first being the prospect of a massive popular revolt against communism, and the second being that the Soviet Union would starve to death. Agriculture never really recovered from collectivization. Grain yields cratered, and the government was forced to lie about how much grain was produced. And of course, then the government went ahead selling grain for money to buy machinery, while millions of people starved to death. I don't know, it's unprecedented. He goes into detail comparing Stalin's regime with Mussolini's regime and with Hitler's regime. And what you do not see this kind of revolutionary mania in either fascist Italy or in Nazi Germany. They call Nazi Germany a totalitarian state, but private property was respected there. What was required was a veneration of Hitler and a willingness or refusal to speak out about the cult of Hitler, which of course in Germany was meant to replace the cult of God. And you look at the economic, he goes into detail about the economic transformation in Mussolini's Italy. It was done without the shocking brutality of Stalin's Soviet Union. I want to read something that's rather representative of the evil. I think a singular evil of Stalin's regime. When Yezhov referred to a transport official as an enemy, Stalin interrupted to specify that the accused was a German spy. He, in fact, got money for information from German intelligence. He was a spy. Addressing Bukharin, Stalin ridiculed suicide as opposition blackmail. Quote, "Here is one of the easiest means by which, right before death, leaving this world, one can spit in the face of the party, deceive the people one last time," unquote, Stalin stated, mentioning Tomsky. Another was the 32-year-old apparatchik Veniamin Führer, who had committed suicide at a dacha in Osinki, outside Moscow, in fall 1936, after his friend Yakov Lifshitz, Kaganovich's top deputy at the railroad commissariat, had been arrested as a Trotskyite. Führer, the rising star who had delivered a stirring ode to the Stalinist leadership style at the 17th Party Congress, left behind a long letter praising the Soviet leader. Yes, you saw that over and over again. Oh, yes, all praise to the man who's arrested me. All praise to the man who's tortured me. All praise to the man who is going to execute me. Yes, Führer had briefly sided with Trotsky in 1923. Because Stalin was on holiday in Sochi, the letter had been brought to Kaganovich. He walked up and down and then began to sob out loud. Nikita Khrushchev, another Kaganovich protege, would recall. He was unable to collect himself for a long time after he read it. Kaganovich ordered the letter circulated to all Politburo members. Now at the plenum, Stalin cruelly mocked Kaganovich. What a letter he left behind, he noted of Führer. You read it and tears well up in your eyes. In Stalin's Soviet Union, there was nothing outside the state. Absolutely nothing outside the state. That would be one thing, but Stalinism was a kind of autoimmune disorder where the state begins consuming itself. Now, Trotsky had been dealt with. His power had been curbed by the mid 1920s, and then he gets expelled from the Soviet Union. But Stalin was obsessed with Trotsky. He's the Emmanuel Goldstein of 1984. That everything bad that happens is the result of Trotsky. And Trotsky apparently has become, he is the leader of the so-called left deviationists, and he is in alliance with the so-called right deviationists, and they have a plan. And the plan is to overthrow communism and bring back capitalism. Now, this is objectively insane, but this is what a vast nation was told, and for the most part, they believed it. Anything bad that happened, now this was blamed on wreckers, kulaks, deviationists. Kotkin goes into considerable example about the paucity of machinery and how it's low quality workers that were not trained properly. And so objectives were not met. There were accidents. None of this was an accident. There are no accidents in Stalinism. It is all sabotage. It is all wrecking. Now, totalitarianism is one thing, but a totalitarianism that turns on itself is quite another. That you have Yagoda, the head of the NKVD, and then you have Yezhov and there's Yezhovshchina, and then you have Beria. And so the leaders of the secret police, or the cadres of the secret police, they were all obsessed with the idea of finding traitors and effectively manufacturing traitors. And of course, this was in the 1930s. This was at a time when people were eager to denounce other people, for revenge, respite, for personal advancement. So there was plenty of evidence around, if you want to call it evidence, because at that time, by the, say, 1936, 1937, pretty much everyone was accusing everyone else of being a traitor, that there were files on practically everyone. But of course, it was known, it was understood that these people really weren't traitors. And the members of the NKVD, from the lowest to the highest, were all obsessed with rounding up and having tried and executed the greatest number of traitors possible, because failure to do so would indicate that you yourself were a traitor. And what was Stalin's reaction to this? He started killing them all off. That the very people who had rounded up vast numbers of people, accused them of treason, and had them imprisoned, tortured, executed, sent to the Gulag, they were themselves traitors. Now, how were they traitors? Well, they could be traitors in two ways. Now, in order to meet the quotas, as it were, of traitors, it was obvious to everyone that evidence was being manufactured. Some of these people got the chop because, you see, you were working against the party because you manufactured evidence against people. Other people got the chop because it turned out that they had been working for the Germans since the 1920s. That many of the top communists whose loyalty was simply not in any doubt, they were arrested, tortured, and killed. There were you often hear that it's not possible for people to withstand torture. Well, Kotkin gives many stirring examples in this book of people who had to be beaten to death or finally finished off with a gunshot to the head because they simply wouldn't agree to swear to things that they knew not to be true. So you just have these waves of the NKVD arresting people, having them tortured, all the rest of it executed, and they themselves fall victim to this, just wave after wave after wave. And then Stalin turned on the armed forces. That apparently all of the marshals, the leading generals, Tukhachevsky and all the rest, they were all traitors. And furthermore, they had always been traitors. Show trials were held in Moscow. And people testified against themselves. They made preposterous claims against themselves, some of them in the hope that their family would be spared. Others, because of the conditions described by Arthur Koestler in his novel Darkness and Noon. You know, if Stalin is a kind of messiah and Stalin has turned against one, well, then the fault must be with one and not with Stalin. That people make much of the personality cult around Hitler, but I would say that Stalin's cult was greater in the sense that, as Kotkin explains, Stalin was a micromanager. There was hardly any aspect of governance in the Soviet Union that he was not involved in, often intimately. Stalin worked ferociously hard. He spent a great deal of time, supposedly on vacation at the so-called near Dhaka and in Georgia, but he never stopped working and he never stopped reading. He just, it's difficult. I think you'd have to go back to Philip II of Spain to find a leader who was more obsessed with the minutiae of government than Stalin was. There seems to have been something of a change in Stalin's personality in the 1930s. You know, the leading communists were all murderers. They're all mass murderers. Lenin, Trotsky, all of them. But Stalin became exceedingly paranoid in the 1930s, and he began to take a personal glee in the degradation and death of his chosen opponents in a way that he had not done previously. The so-called little corner of his apartment is a remarkable situation where this is where the government was, that people would be invited into a little corner and they would talk, and Stalin would give orders. This is not a new insight, but the government of Nazi Germany was exceedingly disorganized. That many things were done. It was not a government in traditional sense. That okay, what does Hitler want? We must fulfill Hitler's wishes. Well, I mean, it's really kind of a divination, because Hitler was very much a big picture guy. He was very much a blue sky guy, as opposed to Stalin, who was interested in all the details. And the two different styles of governments led to problems, because it was difficult in Nazi Germany for managers to decide what to do, because we haven't finished divining Hitler's intentions. The government of the Soviet Union under Stalin became sclerotic because we are going to have to wait for a decision by Stalin. And since Stalin was dealing on a weekly basis with dozens or hundreds of decisions, often you could wait for a very long time. And of course, you did not want to, in many bureaucracies and managerial regimes, you make a decision, and it turns out that the big boss doesn't like it, and you have a kind of plausible deniability, or just the expectation that, well, what are the chances that this one particular decision is going to, come to the attention of the people at the top, and they're going to be looking for a scalp? Well, in Stalinist Russia, they were always looking for scalps. And so the NKVD itself was hollowed out. The Soviet military was hollowed out. And of course, the Soviet Union was fighting at this time in the late 1930s a war, a little reported war with Japan in Mongolia and in occupied China. So this was a very foolish time to decapitate the leadership of the Soviet military. But I suppose Stalin was lucky. I mean, Hitler was lucky for a long time, and then he stopped being lucky. Hitler was lucky up to about the end of, or late 1941, and after that, no, there was no more luck. Stalin was lucky to the end of his life. Stalin did so many things that were objectively wrong in terms of governance, that one could have expected his regime to fall for all sorts of reasons many, many times, but it never happened. I suppose one of the reasons that it never happened is that you have this kind of Stockholm syndrome that takes over an entire country. I mentioned this phenomenon of a Bolshevik speak, a Bolshevik speech, that Marxism. See, this is the way it goes from Marx to Lenin, and then to Stalin. That Lenin was the great interpreter of Marx, particularly, in a concrete sense, because Marx is pretty much all theoretical with Marx. But with Lenin, you get down to the nuts and bolts, especially since Lenin was actually running a country. But Stalin, he posited himself as Lenin's greatest student. That was very clever of him, and Stalin was an exceedingly clever man. That a more vain man than Stalin would have taken the position that no, we put Lenin behind us. Lenin, he had some good ideas, but he got various things wrong. And it's not Leninism, it's Stalinism as a theory that we want to talk about that. No, but you see, Stalin, he was the humble student of Lenin. One is terribly impressed reading Kotkin at just how skillful a politician Stalin was. That he was constantly threatening to resign. He's only the chairman of the party, and I work for the party, and if you want my job, you can have it. I resign. No, we can't let you resign. So he maintained that there's no cult. There's no cult of Stalin. There is not this ruthless hoarding of power from every direction in the state. No. You just have this humble student of Lenin who's trying to do his best for the party. And he was a moderate, you see, because the enemies were the extremists. Now, this takes a lot of confidence to pull off. A man like Stalin claiming to be a moderate. But you see, on the one hand, you have the left deviationists like Trotsky. And on the right hand, you have the right deviationists like Bukharin. And I'm in the middle. I found the happy ground in the middle. It's this extremism that is the real enemy. And he actually made it. He actually made it work. That he surrounded himself with people who, occasionally, from Kaganovich or perhaps there would actually be some disagreement. But this was a one-man show. Certainly in Nazi Germany was nothing at all like that. Stalin was a prisoner of Marxism, or this Bolshevik speak, and of course he nearly came a cropper many times in foreign affairs. Into 1939, he continued to believe that Britain was the biggest threat to the Soviet Union. And I guess he's thinking, about Britain as being the leading colonial power. But of course, it was obvious that Germany was the greatest potential threat to the Soviet Union. But Stalin, even after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, he continued to look at Britain as the great threat. Now, of course, as we know, as it turned out, that Britain was a paper tiger, because Britain and France had given guarantees to Poland in 1938. And I am not one of those people who rails against Neville Chamberlain. I think that he was mostly a sound man, and his policy of not going to war before the British military had been vastly expanded was a very good policy. But his decision to give this guarantee to Poland, France also gave the guarantee, was an absolute disaster. And it dragged Britain and France, for that matter, into a war in which they could do nothing. Because, when the invasion of September 1st of Poland came about, what was Britain going to do? Britain was in no position to do anything. And Britain was in very little position, in fact, to do much when France was invaded in 1940. I mean, it would have been possible for Britain to sit out, but there was a belief by Chamberlain and others in Britain at the time that this guarantee given to Poland was somehow going to put Hitler off, or that it would put off Stalin. Now, of course, 16 days after the Germans invaded Poland, the Soviet Union invaded Poland. This has been memory hold, because as has the alliance between Stalin and Hitler, and also that the leftists of the world suddenly they didn't want war with Hitler anymore. That would be an imperialist war. Only imperialists wanted a war with Germany, because Germany was the Soviet Union's ally. When we hear from many of these people talking about the veterans, American veterans, British veterans, Canadian veterans, that they'd be all for punching Nazis, that is to say, supposed members of the alt-right, you might want to rub that into them. That the entire leftist establishment around the world was objectively an ally of Hitler for 2 years. Of course, previous to that, for many years, Stalin had decided that the social democratic parties in Europe were the primary enemy. And he forbade any kind of alliance between the social democrats. He called that social fascism, between the communists and the social Democrats. So Kotkin shows how Poland was attempting to survive by perhaps looking to the Soviet Union, perhaps looking to Germany. As I said earlier, in the absence of a remarkable man like Pilsudski, Poland was almost certainly doomed. But so the Soviet Union, before the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was signed, they were engaged in negotiations with both Britain and France, and they didn't take them seriously. There's a hilarious example where Britain sends a team to the Soviet Union for negotiations over a possible treaty, and they send them overland or by not by plane, but by a vessel, by ships on the water, slow-moving ships. And then when they show up, and we're talking about things are getting really desperate, in the summer of 1939. It turns out that these diplomats do not have the authority to actually make an agreement. And of course, the difference between that and Germany couldn't be any starker. That Ribbentrop was determined to get an agreement with Stalin. He was determined to make compromises if necessary, and the Germans made many compromises, and they continued to make compromises even after the treaty was signed. After the dual invasion, you had the Germans gave up territory in the Ukraine, very valuable territory in terms of oil deposits and the like, and they gave this to the Soviet Union because of their determination to keep the alliance together. So the book ends on the verge of the German invasion of Russia, and of course Stalin had put his trust in Hitler, which was a disastrous decision from which he almost never recovered. I mentioned suicide right at the very beginning. Stalin's wife committed suicide. She had with a small Derringer pistol. She was a feminist. She had her own career outside of Stalin. She was not much of a family woman. Her children never saw much of her. And as far as I could, it seemed like a situation where she was envious of her husband. And they drifted apart. They argued, and one day she shot herself. As I say, this was kept a secret from the people. On a personal level, Stalin was a very affectionate man. He's very affectionate with his children, well, especially his daughter, Svetlana. His son, not so much. He considered him to be a screw-up, and didn't like him very much. Stalin, he liked to eat, despite he had suffered from many severe physical ailments. And, when considering the amount of work that he put in, this is a testament to his strength of will. He liked to drink, he liked to laugh, he liked to sing, he liked to dance. He liked his places in the country. He was a great fan of music, mostly popular music, the low sort. But he was also an admirer of Mozart. He was a record collector. He would listen to there's a famous story, which happens to be true, of a pianist, what's her name, Maria Udina, that he heard a performance of a Mozart piano concerto on the radio and asked for a copy, and of course there was no copy, and so everyone was in a panic, and they had to make a copy, and which was done live on an acetate, and it fell apart. They had to bring in another conductor, and he fainted, and it took hours and hours and hours. We know that this is true because the actual acetate was found amongst Stalin's possessions after his death, and remarkably, the recording by Udina is now available commercially. Stalin was something of a mystery to his people. He wasn't seen in public very often. Hitler had a very sophisticated understanding of public relations, that he had a personal photographer, Hoffman, that he was constantly being photographed, walking in the Bavarian Alps, or patting children on the head. And there'd be photographs, postcards of this sold. And he had photographs taken. He had this house constructed in Bavaria, in his redoubt, with these fabulous views. You know, that Hitler was the great man of all things, a great architect. You know, all that sort of thing. And Stalin, for all of the cult of personality, he really was a mystery to most Russians. He didn't sell himself to the Russian people in the way that Hitler did to the German people. That I'm struck over and over again reading Kotkin's biography of Stalin, just how relevant it is to our present age. That you have a world that has gone mad, but where the mad congratulate themselves on their sanity and resolve once again to hunt down all of those people who are not insane. You have the growth of a vocabulary which becomes mandatory, which has no possible relevance to ordinary life or even to sanity. And this vocabulary is constantly being redefined. That things that were acceptable last year or last month or even last week suddenly are no longer acceptable, and everyone says, all right. And the trick is to pretend that nothing has changed, that it was always like that. That we are ruled now, as was the case in Stalin's Russia, although it is nowhere near as violent, of course, by people who hate us. That, of course, Stalin was a Georgian. He was not a Russian. He hated to be reminded of his Roman origins. He spoke in Georgian accented Russian throughout his life. He surrounded himself, his cronies were for the most part not Russians. Did he have any kind of feeling at all for his adopted country, of which he was the absolute ruler? It doesn't seem like it, in the same way that Hitler, of course, was not a German. He was an Austrian. He was Hitler. He was history's worst immigrant. This book is so rich in detail and characterization that it is. One would think that it is something of a chore. I'm now 2,000 pages into, or more into, after volume 2, but I'm eagerly looking forward to volume 3, because for all sorts of reasons. One of which is that, again, if you had made up the character of Stalin, no one would have believed you. It is such an extraordinary story, and it's a terrifying testament to what people will put up with, to how far, how much people can be, a whole nation can be degraded, insulted, brutalized. Again, this is one of the greatest biographies that I have ever read, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. So that would be volume 2 of Stephen Kotkin's biography of Stalin, or Waiting for Hitler, 1928 to 1941. I am going to take a final look at the chat. Let's see. I just scroll down here. From coup attempt to hero, okay. Look up the Barras says, all my life I've been an annoying person, though nobody knows my real name here. They had enough of me when I was 13, and they sent me to the University Faculty of Mathematics. Okay. Yalta was a fight, not a meeting. Go figure. Eternal Fisherman says, Stalin led the Bolshevization of Menshevik-ruled Georgia and afraid he wasn't nice to Georgians either. Um, well, yes. Yes, as I say, there was he didn't like to be reminded that he was a Georgian, that he spoke in a Georgian accent, and you have this phenomenon of people who are neither one thing or the other, and this is not good. It's not good for anybody. These people are a menace. The people do not have a clear understanding of their own people. They're the ones to watch out for. Eternal Fisherman says Austrians are Germans. Well, I was reading recently that Werner Herzog, the great director, said that he doesn't like Prussians very much, and that he doesn't refer to himself as a German. He refers to himself as a Bavarian, because of course there are tremendous differences between the peoples in the various parts of Germany. So that is the show for today, March 27th. And I would like to thank you all for tuning in. If you like the show or any part of it, I would appreciate it if you would click the like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. If you would like to support the show, my PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. And I wish you all a happy weekend. And once again, I'm not really joking about this. I mean, in these days of social isolation, social distancing, I hope that none of you are lonely, that you manage to find some kind of human connection to keep you going throughout these terrible times. Bye-bye.